I was summoned as the Demon King's servant. My real contract was with his daughter. Nobody asks if you want to be summoned. That is the first thing Kael learned about the demon world. There is no warning, no preparation, no moment where someone sits across from you and explains what is about to happen and gives you the option to decline. One moment you are in your own world, living your own life, and the next moment the ground underneath you has been replaced by something else entirely, and the air you are breathing is different and the light is wrong, and there are beings standing in a circle around you that your entire frame of reference is scrambling to process. Kael had been walking home from a late shift at the kind of job that exists specifically for people the world has not yet found a better use for, unremarkable work at an unremarkable hour, when the summoning circle opened beneath his feet and took him. He arrived in the demon world on his knees. Not because he had been forced into that position. Because the transition from one world to another at that speed, with no preparation and no warning, hits the body in a way that the legs do not immediately recover from. He was on his knees on a stone floor that was black and cold and polished to a mirror finish, and around him in a wide circle were the runes of the summoning array still glowing with the residual energy of a working that had just completed, and beyond the circle were demons. He had a few seconds to take them in before anyone spoke. They were tall. Most of them. The ones standing closest to the circle were wearing something that read as formal, layered dark fabric with structured shoulders and insignia that he did not know how to read but understood instinctively as rank markers. Their features were angular in ways that human faces were not, sharper at the jaw and cheekbone, eyes that held color in a different way than human eyes, not just a different shade but a different depth, like the color went further back than it should. Several of them had features that marked them as something other than simply tall humans in elaborate clothing. Horns in varying configurations. A stillness to their movement that suggested they were controlling how much they were moving rather than standing naturally still. The one standing at the head of the circle, directly in front of where Kael had arrived, was speaking before Kael had fully processed his surroundings. The language was not one Kael knew. And then, smoothly and without announcement, it was. The summoning, apparently, came with translation. He filed this away and focused on what was being said. The demon at the head of the circle was reading from something, a formal document by the cadence and structure of the words, the kind of language used for official declarations rather than conversation. He was listing classifications. Summoning rank. Assessment tier. Service designation. Kael understood, as the reading continued, that this was the process by which summoned humans were evaluated and assigned within the demon world's hierarchy. You arrived through the circle, and the circle's own assessment function measured you against the demon world's classification metrics and assigned you a rank before you had stood up from the floor. The reading stopped. The demon at the head of the circle looked at his document. Then he looked at Kael. Then he looked at his document again with the expression of someone who has found a discrepancy they were not expecting and are not sure whether to find it amusing or irritating. He announced Kael's summoning rank. The word he used translated, in the framework the summoning had built in Kael's understanding, as something between negligible and beneath formal classification. The lowest tier the system recognized. The rank assigned to humans whose presence in the demon world was assessed as having no meaningful contribution potential and whose primary utility was in tasks that demons of any standing did not want to perform themselves. The other demons in the circle reacted. Not with cruelty exactly. With the specific kind of dismissal that is worse than cruelty because it does not even require effort. A few of them looked away immediately, because Kael's rank had confirmed he was not worth the attention they had briefly given him. One of them said something under his breath to the demon beside him that Kael could not fully parse but whose tone translated perfectly across any language barrier. One of them laughed, short and flat, the laugh of someone who found the situation mildly funny in the way that small things are funny when they are beneath your concern. Kael got up from his knees. He did it steadily. Not making a performance of it. Not trying to project anything in particular. He stood up because he was done being on the floor, and he looked at the demon at the head of the circle with the same quality of attention he gave anything he was trying to understand. The demon at the head of the circle looked mildly surprised. Not at Kael standing. At the way he was standing. The expression of someone who had expected a particular kind of response and was recalibrating slightly because what they were looking at was not it. He told Kael, in the formal cadence of official processing, that he had been summoned to serve in the household of the Demon King. That his rank designated him for the lowest tier of servant classification. That he would be given quarters appropriate to his rank, assigned duties appropriate to his rank, and afforded the considerations appropriate to his rank. He said this last phrase in a way that made clear the considerations were not significant. Kael said he understood. The demon looked at him for a moment longer than the processing required. Then he gestured to a smaller demon standing at the edge of the circle, clearly a functionary of some kind, and said something that translated as take him to the lower servant quarters and get him out of the formal hall. The functionary stepped forward. He was shorter than the others and moved with the energy of someone who had spent a long time being junior in this particular hierarchy and had made their peace with it. He looked at Kael with an expression that was not unkind but was not warm either. Neutral in the specific way of someone who processed new arrivals regularly and had learned not to invest in them until they had proven they were going to be around long enough to make investment worthwhile. His name, he said as he led Kael out of the formal summoning hall and into the corridor beyond, was Remington. He was responsible for orientation of newly summoned servants at Kael's classification level. He said this with the slightly weary efficiency of someone delivering information they had delivered many times before. The corridor was enormous. Kael had understood intellectually that this was a palace. The summoning documentation, such as it was, had made that clear. But intellectual understanding and walking through it were different things. The ceilings were high enough that the upper reaches were lost in a quality of shadow that was not quite darkness, more like the light did not feel obligated to reach that far. The walls were the same black stone as the formal hall, polished and cold and reflecting the light sources in a way that made the corridor feel like it extended further than it actually did. The scale of everything was calibrated for beings larger than Kael and carrying more presence than Kael currently projected, and the effect was that he felt, walking through it, like a detail in a composition that had not been designed with him in mind. That he found this interesting rather than intimidating. Rem was talking as they walked, the practiced rhythm of a briefing that covered the basic structure of life at his rank in the palace. Duties began at a specific hour. Meals were at specific times in the lower servant hall. There were areas of the palace accessible to his rank and areas that were not, and he should familiarize himself with the boundaries quickly because crossing them without authorization carried consequences that Rem described with a matter-of-fact neutrality that made them sound considerably worse than dramatic language would have. Kael listened and mapped and noted. He noted the layout of the corridors they moved through. He noted the rank insignia on the demons they passed and the way those demons registered him, or more accurately did not register him, the specific invisibility of being ranked low enough in a hierarchy that the people above you have trained themselves not to see you unless they need something. He noted the light sources, which were not fire and not electricity but something between the two that pulsed very slightly at irregular intervals. He noted the temperature, which was cool in a way that had presence to it, the kind of cool that came from the stone itself rather than from the air. And he noted the system. It had opened in his chest the moment he arrived, quiet and present the way it had been in his own world, not announcing itself but available. He had not had time to look at it properly since the summoning hall. Now, walking through the corridor with Rem's briefing running in one ear and the palace establishing itself around him, he opened it carefully. The display was different here than it had been in his world. In his world the system had interfaced with human classification frameworks, reading rank and ability and contract status in the terms that the human world used. Here it had adapted. The same underlying functions were present but the labels and metrics had shifted to interface with the demon world's classification structure, the way the translation function had shifted to give him the language. The system was not confused by the new environment. It had adjusted. He read through his own status first. Summoned rank, negligible, matching what the formal hall's assessment had produced. His own system's assessment of himself was different, more complex, running on metrics that the demon world summoning circle had not measured and would not have known to measure. The contractor functions were listed. The site of origin was listed. The ability unlock function was listed. All of it intact and active, just waiting. Then he looked at what the site of origin was doing. It was running passively the way it always ran, making information available without requiring him to direct it actively. As they moved through the corridors, it was reading the demons they passed and displaying their information at the edge of his awareness. Rank. Ability classification. Hidden ability status. Most of the demons they passed were exactly what they appeared to be. High-ranked, powerful in ways that were real and not concealed, operating at the level their insignia suggested. Then they passed a junction in the corridor. To the left, the main corridor continued toward what Rem had indicated was the central palace complex. To the right, a secondary corridor branched off and ran for a distance before ending at a set of doors that were different from every other door they had passed. Everything else in this palace was designed to be imposing. Large, heavy, made from the same dark stone with fittings that demonstrated both wealth and power. These doors were sealed. Not just closed. Sealed. There was a faint shimmer around the frame that was not decorative, the visible edge of a working that had been set into the stone itself, something that had been maintained long enough that it had become part of the structure. The site of origin pulled toward it. Not forcefully. Not with urgency. The way a compass needle moves when you bring it near a source of magnetic force, a steady, unavoidable orientation that did not require a decision. Whatever was behind those doors was registering in his system as something significant. He could not yet read the full information display. The system was showing him the edges of something too large to fit in the current frame, the way a very bright light produces glow before you can see the source. He kept walking. He noted the doors and he noted where they were in relation to everything else, and he noted the shimmer of the ceiling array, and he did not say anything to Rem about any of it. Rem had not even glanced in that direction as they passed the junction. The lower servant quarters were in the eastern wing of the palace, a section where the architecture was the same material as the rest of the building but the scale had compressed. Ceilings at a height designed for the humans who occupied this section rather than the demons who occupied everything else. The rooms were small and functional. His room had a bed, a surface that served as a desk, a window that looked out onto an interior courtyard, and nothing else. It was clean. It was not comfortable in any way that went beyond the basic definition of the word. It was what you were given when you had been assessed as having negligible value to the household and the household was performing the minimum obligation of the summoning contract. Rem completed his briefing at the door and told Kael that duties began the following morning. He would be collected at the appropriate hour. He said this last thing with a slight pause that Kael read correctly as Rem performing a check, seeing whether Kael was going to react to any of what he had been told in a way that required management. Most newly summoned servants at this rank reacted to their first day with some combination of fear, protest, confusion, or a kind of stunned passivity that required handling. Kael said he understood and thanked him for the orientation. Rem looked at him for a moment. Then he said, in a slightly different register than the official briefing voice he had been using, that Kael should pay attention to the boundaries he had described. He said it not as a threat. As something closer to genuine advice. He said the palace was a place where rank was the only protection available to someone at Kael's level, and ignoring the limits of that rank had a way of producing outcomes that could not be recovered from. Kael said he would be careful. Rem nodded once and left. Kael went into his room and sat on the edge of the bed and opened his status window fully for the first time since arriving. He read through everything carefully. The contractor functions. The site of origin. The ability unlock. The contract requirements. All of it exactly as it had been in his world, all of it adapted to interface with the demon world's framework, all of it waiting. He thought about the sealed doors. He thought about what the system had done when they passed the junction, the way the site of origin had oriented toward whatever was behind that ceiling array without being asked, the partial information display that suggested something his system had not encountered a full equivalent of before. He thought about what that meant. In his experience, the system did not pull toward things that were irrelevant to him. The site of origin had led him to Lyra because Lyra was someone his ability was built to find. It had led him to Ceres because Ceres was someone his ability was built to find. The system was not random and it was not indiscriminate. It found specific things. Specific people. Whatever was behind those doors was someone his system was built to find. He lay back on the bed and looked at the ceiling, which was lower than the rest of the palace and felt almost normal by comparison. He was in the demon world. He was ranked as negligible. He had been summoned without consent into a place where every being around him had more formal power than he did, and most of them had already decided he was not worth looking at. He had been in situations like this before. Not in a demon palace, not with this specific set of variables, but the essential shape of it was familiar. The world had made up its mind about him based on a number, and the number was wrong, and the only interesting question was how long it was going to take before the world figured that out. He was patient. He closed the status window and let the system run quietly in his chest the way it always did, and looked at the ceiling of his small room in the lower servant quarters of the Demon King's palace and felt, underneath everything, the specific alertness of someone who has arrived somewhere significant and knows it and is in no hurry because the knowing is enough for now. Outside his window the interior courtyard was lit by the same pulsing light sources as the corridors. Somewhere in the palace, in a sealed wing behind doors that shimmered with a working set into the stone itself, something that the site of origin could not yet fully display was present and waiting in the same way that he was. He did not know her name yet. He did not know what she looked like or what she had been told about herself or how long she had been behind those doors or what the world had decided to do with something it could not categorize. He would find out. He was in no hurry. Tomorrow his duties began and the palace would become familiar and the familiar would become navigable and the navigable would become the ground he operated from. That was how it always worked. You started from where you were and you learned the space and then you moved through it in the direction the system was already pointing. The direction was clear. The first week in the Demon King's palace had a rhythm to it. Not a comfortable rhythm. Not the kind that settles into your body and makes the days feel natural. The kind that is imposed from the outside, structured and unyielding, designed not around the people performing it but around the needs of the institution requiring it. Kael learned it the way he learned everything, by watching first and then moving into it once he understood the shape of what he was stepping into. His duties were exactly what the summoning rank suggested they would be. He cleaned. He carried. He moved things from one part of the palace to another at the direction of demons who did not look at him while they directed him and did not acknowledge him when the task was complete. He worked in the lower corridors and the service areas and the parts of the palace that the high-ranking demons passed through only when they needed to get somewhere and considered the getting there beneath their attention. He worked alongside other summoned humans, most of whom had been here longer than him, some of whom had been here long enough that the palace had become the only world they practically remembered. He talked to them when the work allowed it. Not extensively, not in ways that drew notice from the demon staff who supervised the servant sections, but in the small exchanges that happen naturally when people share the same physical space over enough days. He learned names. He learned histories. He learned the landscape of the palace as it actually existed for people at his rank, which was different from the landscape as it appeared to anyone looking down from above. A woman named Petra had been here for 6 years. She had arrived the same way Kael had, without warning, without consent, through a summoning circle that had opened under her feet in the middle of an ordinary day. She had a daughter in the human world who would be 8 years old now, and she thought about that every day in the specific way that people think about things they cannot change and have learned to carry rather than put down. She worked in the kitchen sections and she knew the palace's daily schedule better than most of the demon staff who were supposed to be managing it. A man named Soren had been here for 3 years. He was quiet in the deliberate way of someone who had learned that quiet was the safest register to operate in. He worked the same corridor rotations as Kael and they had fallen into a pattern of working the same sections without discussing it, the kind of comfortable parallel that develops between people who understand each other's preferred way of moving through a space. An older man named Dale had been here for 11 years. He rarely spoke, and when he did it was in the economical way of someone who had reduced everything to what was necessary and let go of what was not. He had the specific quality of someone who had made a very complete peace with where they were, not happily, but completely, in the way that is sometimes the only available option when the alternative is a grief that cannot be sustained indefinitely. Kael listened to all of them and learned from all of them and did not tell any of them what his system was showing him. Because his system was showing him things. The site of origin ran passively through every day, making information available the way it always had, and the information it was gathering in this palace was building into a picture that had texture and depth and a shape he was beginning to understand. He read the demons he served without appearing to read them. He noted which abilities were as advertised and which ones had layers that their official rank designations did not fully capture. He noted the hierarchy as it actually functioned versus how it was formally structured, which were not always the same thing. He noted who deferred to whom and who resented the deferring and where the lines of genuine power ran underneath the official ones. All of this was useful. All of this was the ground he was building to operate from. But underneath all of it, every day, was the sealed wing. His corridor rotation did not take him past the junction where he had first seen the sealed doors. The lower servant quarters were in the eastern section and his assigned work areas were in the service corridors of the central palace, and the sealed wing was in a direction that his rotation did not intersect. He had not seen the doors again since the first night. But the system had not stopped registering what was behind them. Even at the distance his work kept him from that part of the palace, the site of origin maintained its orientation. Not actively. Not pulling at him or demanding attention. But present, the way a sound you cannot quite hear is present, at the edge of your awareness, reminding you it is there without being loud enough to identify. Whatever was in that sealed wing was registering in his system at a level that distance did not diminish. He was patient. He had told himself he was patient and he was, genuinely. But patient did not mean unaware. On the fourth day, he found out what the sealed wing was called. He was working in the upper service corridor adjacent to the formal dining section, polishing the light fixtures that lined the walls, a task that required him to move slowly along the corridor with a cloth and a solution that the demon staff used to maintain the particular quality of the light pulse. It was the kind of task that made him invisible in exactly the right way. Doing it, he was just part of the maintenance of the space, something the demons who passed through could register as present without needing to actually see. 2 demon officials walked through while he was working. They were not speaking quietly. They were having the conversation of people who had assessed their surroundings and concluded that no one present required discretion. Kael was part of the surroundings. He kept his cloth moving against the light fixture and he listened. They were discussing logistics. Rotation of the guard detail assigned to the sealed wing. A question about the maintenance of the sealing array, whether the current configuration required reinforcement before the end of the month or whether the scheduled inspection would be sufficient. One of them referenced an authorization level required to access the wing's outer corridor and the other confirmed it and noted that the authorization list had not changed in several years. Then one of them said a name. Vane. The other one said something in response that Kael could not fully catch because they had moved further down the corridor, but the word before the name had been distinct. The lady. Lady Vane. He kept working. His face did not change. His hands did not stop moving. Externally he was exactly what the 2 officials had assessed him as being, part of the maintenance of the space, beneath notice. Internally he was filing everything he had just heard into the structure he was building. Lady Vane. Daughter of the Demon King. Sealed wing. Guard rotation. Sealing array requiring maintenance. Several years without change to the authorization list. He thought about what it meant that the Demon King's daughter was in a sealed wing with a guard rotation and a sealing array that required regular maintenance. He thought about the difference between someone being protected and someone being contained. He thought about what his system had shown him at the junction that first night, the partial information display, the sense of something too large for the current frame. He thought about all of this and he kept polishing the light fixtures and said nothing. On the sixth day he saw the Demon King for the first time. It was not a formal occasion. He was not summoned or presented. He was carrying a load of linens through a service corridor that connected two sections of the palace when the Demon King walked through an intersecting passage 20 meters ahead. That he stopped because you stopped when the Demon King moved through a space. That was one of the first things anyone at his rank learned. Not because there was an explicit rule requiring it, though there probably was somewhere in the formal protocols. Because the energy of the space changed when he moved through it in a way that stopping was the natural response to. Every demon in the passage had stilled and oriented toward him, and the silence was the specific silence of a hierarchy acknowledging its apex. Kael stopped and looked. The Demon King was tall in the way that suggested the scale of the palace had been built for him rather than him being built for the palace. He moved with the quality of someone who had never in his life needed to consider whether a space would accommodate him. His features were the angular sharpness of the demon structure taken to its most complete expression, and his eyes, when they swept the passage in the automatic survey of someone accustomed to reading rooms, were a color that did not translate to any reference point Kael had for color. Not dark. Not bright. Something that seemed to shift depending on how the light from the fixtures caught them. The sight of origin activated without him directing it. He did not read the full display. He caught the edges of it before he pulled the ability back, not wanting to draw attention by whatever visible indicator active ability use might produce in this environment. What he caught was enough. Power at a level that confirmed what the hierarchy of this palace suggested. Ability classification at a tier that the demon world's highest rankings designated. And underneath the official classification, in the layer the sight of origin could always reach, something he had not expected. Grief. Not fresh grief. Old grief. The kind that has been carried so long it has become structural, part of the way the person moves through the world, present in the set of the shoulders and the quality of the eyes and the particular way the face manages its own expressions. The Demon King looked like a man who had made a decision he could not unmake and had been living with it for long enough that living with it had become indistinguishable from who he was. Kael filed this away. The Demon King passed through the intersection and the energy of the space released and the demons around Kael resumed movement and he picked up the linens and kept walking. He thought about grief carried long enough to become structural. He thought about a sealed wing and a sealing array and a daughter who had been behind those doors for years and a father who had put her there and the shape of the thing that connected those two facts. On the eighth day, Kael's rotation changed. Not by his request. The rotation assignments were managed by the demon staff who oversaw the servant sections, and changes happened when the palace's maintenance needs shifted or when a servant was reassigned based on performance assessment or when the schedule simply cycled to a different configuration. He had not done anything to prompt a change and he had not asked for one. But on the eighth day Rem found him at the start of the work period and told him his corridor assignment had been updated. The eastern service corridors, which covered the maintenance of the palace's less frequented sections, had a gap in coverage. Kael was being moved to fill it. The eastern service corridors included the junction. He said he understood and followed Rem to the new assignment. The junction looked the same as it had the first night. The main corridor continuing to the left. The secondary corridor branching to the right, running its length, ending at the sealed doors. The shimmer of the sealing array around the door frame, faint and steady and permanent looking, the shimmer of something that had been maintained so long it had become architectural, the sight of origin oriented immediately. Stronger now. Closer. The partial information display that had been showing him edges from a distance was showing him more from here, the frame expanding slightly, enough that he could see the shape of what the system was building toward even if the full display was still not available. He began his assigned work in the eastern service corridor. He worked slowly, maintaining the same pattern he used everywhere, moving steadily with no variation in pace that would suggest anything other than the routine maintenance he was assigned to perform. He was in the eastern corridor every day now, which meant he was near the junction every day, which meant the system had a closer proximity to whatever it was trying to fully read. He did not approach the secondary corridor. He was not ready to approach it yet. Proximity without context was not useful. He needed to understand more about the ceiling array, the guard rotation, the authorization requirements, before he moved toward those doors in any way that went beyond passing near the junction in the course of his assigned work. It was on the 11th day that something changed. He was in the Eastern Service corridor, midway through his rotation, when he heard something he had not heard before. A sound from the secondary corridor. Not the sound of the guards who rotated through that section on the schedule he had spent days mapping. Not mechanical or structural. A sound that required a person to produce it. Quiet enough that if he had not been close to the junction at the right moment he would have missed it entirely. He stopped. He stood very still and listened with the same quality of attention he had used in the hunting zones in his own world, the full directed focus that stripped out everything that was not the specific thing he was trying to hear. It came again. It was a voice. Low, not quite reaching him fully, the words not distinguishable, but the quality of it distinct. It was not the voice of someone speaking to another person. It had the quality of someone speaking in the way people speak when they are alone, when language is being used not for communication but for something else, something closer to the way you use words when you are trying to hold on to them, when language is the thing between you and complete silence. The system flared. Not the passive orientation it had been maintaining since he arrived. A full activation, the site of origin opening completely and reaching toward the secondary corridor with the urgency of a compass needle finding north after being kept away from it, and the information display that had been showing him partial frames for 11 days expanded all at once. He read it. Name, Vane. Classification, unresolvable by standard demon world metrics. Visible rank, suppressed, unable to assess due to active containment array. Hidden ability. The system paused here in a way it had never paused before, the display holding on this line longer than any other line had ever taken, and then it completed. Hidden ability, origin class, unclassified, exists outside established ranking parameters, no equivalent recorded in demon world or human world classification systems. A new entry field appeared below it that the system had generated rather than retrieved. Designation, created by system. Bridge class. A being whose nature connects the foundational elements of two separate worlds. Power potential, immeasurable by current metrics. Contract status, none. Relationship history, none. He read it 3 times. Bridge class. Origin class. Immeasurable by current metrics. He thought about what that meant. He thought about a classification system that covered the entire demon world and the entire human world and all of the ability types that existed across both, and he thought about a being that existed outside all of it, that the combined frameworks of 2 worlds had no category for, and he thought about why the Demon King would seal something like that away rather than let the world see it that he thought he understood. Not completely. But enough. If you were the Demon King and you had a daughter whose nature could not be classified by any system either world had produced, whose power potential registered as immeasurable, whose existence raised questions that neither the demon noble houses nor the human political structures would respond to neutrally, you had a problem with no clean solution. The world did not respond well to things it could not categorize. The world responded to those things with the specific fear that comes from the absence of a framework, and fear and powerful people produced responses that were rarely good for the thing they were afraid of. The Demon King had made a choice. Lock it away. Contain it. Buy time by making it invisible. It was not a good choice. It was the choice of someone who had run out of other options that felt safe enough to take. The voice from the secondary corridor came again, still low, still not fully reaching him, but closer to resolving into something distinguishable. The guards were not in the secondary corridor right now. They rotated through on a schedule he had mapped, and there was a window of approximately 12 minutes in each rotation cycle where the secondary corridor was unoccupied between the departure of one pair and the arrival of the next. He was inside that window right now. He looked at the junction. He thought about Rem's advice on the first night. The boundaries he had been told about. The consequences described with matter-of-fact neutrality. He thought about 11 days of patience, of learning the space, of building the understanding that made the next step possible rather than reckless. He had not been moving toward those doors. He had been moved toward them. By his rotation change. By the schedule. By the window in the guard rotation that he had spent days mapping without knowing yet what he would do with the knowledge. The system had not pushed him. It had waited, the way it always waited, until the conditions were right and the ground was prepared, and the next step was not a leap into the unknown but a movement into something he understood well enough to navigate. He was ready. He moved into the secondary corridor. The shimmer of the ceiling array was stronger here, visible not just at the door frame but as a faint presence throughout the corridor itself, the working extending further than the door alone. He walked at the same pace he used everywhere, steady and unhurried, and he moved toward the sealed doors and stopped when he was close enough to see them properly for the first time. They were not as large as he had imagined from the junction. Human scale, approximately. Designed for someone his size rather than for the demons who inhabited the rest of the palace. The stone of the frame was the same black polished material as everything else, but the doors themselves were different, a darker shade, the kind of dark that absorbed rather than reflected, and the ceiling array covered them completely, rune work laid so densely it had become a texture rather than individual symbols. The voice was clearer now. Words, almost. The language of the demon world filtered through the translation the summoning had given him, but distorted slightly, as if the ceiling array affected not just physical passage but the transmission of sound, compressing it or muffling it or both. He stood in front of the sealed doors and he did something he had not done since arriving in the demon world. He spoke. Quietly. Very quietly. Not loud enough to reach beyond this corridor. He said he was not going to pretend he had not been standing outside listening. He said he did not know if she could hear him through the doors or through the array. He said his name was Kael and he had been summoned to the palace 11 days ago and assigned to the Eastern Service Corridor, and he was fairly sure the assignment was not a coincidence, though he acknowledged he could not prove that he paused. The voice on the other side of the doors stopped. Silence. The specific quality of silence that is produced not by the absence of a person but by a person choosing not to make sound. He said he was not a guard and he was not an official and he was not anyone the palace considered significant enough to be worth managing. He said he had an ability that told him things about people that standard assessment did not measure. He said what it had told him about her was not something he was going to say through a sealed door in a corridor because that was not how that information should be delivered. He said he would be in this corridor every day as part of his assigned work. He said he was not going to press or push or ask for anything she was not ready to give. He said he just wanted her to know that he was there and that he knew, in the way that mattered, what she actually was. Silence. He waited. Then, from behind the sealed doors, through the ceiling array and the compressed sound and the 11 days of a person being entirely alone on the other side of a door that no one came through for any reason except obligation, a voice came back to him. Clearer than it had been when he was at the junction. Present and controlled in a way that told him, even through a sealed door, that this was not a person who had lost themselves in the isolation. This was a person who had maintained themselves through it through effort and will and the specific stubbornness of someone who had decided that what they were was not going to be defined by where they had been put. She asked him what he thought he knew. He said he knew she was not what the demon world's classification system said she was. He knew she was not what the ceiling array was designed to make her seem. He knew that what she actually was had no category in any framework either world had built, and that the absence of a category was what had frightened the people around her badly enough to put her behind these doors. He said he knew that the absence of a category was not the same thing as the absence of worth. The silence after that was different from the silence before it. He did not try to fill it. He waited, in the corridor, in front of the sealed doors, in the window between one guard rotation and the next, and he let the silence be what it needed to be. When she spoke again her voice had shifted. Still controlled. Still the voice of someone who had learned to manage what they let show. But underneath the control there was something that had not been there the first time she spoke. Something that is very difficult to produce artificially and very difficult to hide when it is genuine. She asked him how long he was going to be assigned to this corridor. He said he did not know. Rotation assignments changed. But he was here now and he would be here tomorrow, and as long as the assignment held he would be in this corridor every day during the window when the guards were between rotations. She said that was 12 minutes. He said yes. She said that was not very long. He said it was enough to start. Another silence. Shorter this time. Then she said his name. Not as a greeting. Not as an acknowledgement. In the specific way you say a name when you are testing whether it feels like something you can trust, turning it over in your mind to see if it holds up. Kael, she said. He said yes. She said she had not spoken to anyone who was not required to be there in a very long time. He said he understood. She said she did not know yet if she believed him. About what he claimed to know. About what he claimed his ability could tell him. She said she had been given reasons to be careful about what she believed. He said that was reasonable. He said he was not asking her to believe him yet. He was asking her to let the 12 minutes happen every day and decide what she believed from that. The sound of the guard rotation approaching reached him from the main corridor. He had approximately 2 minutes before the incoming pair would turn into the secondary corridor and find him where he was standing. He said he had to go. He said he would be here tomorrow. She did not say anything for a moment. Then she said she would be here too. He almost smiled. He turned and walked back toward the junction at the same steady pace he had used to approach, and he turned into the main corridor and resumed his position in the Eastern Service corridor with the maintenance cloth in his hand and his expression at the baseline neutral of a servant doing assigned work, and the guard rotation came through the junction 30 seconds later and registered him as part of the maintenance of the space and moved on. He kept working. Inside his chest the system was doing something it had not done since the first contract. Not a formal registration, not yet. But the preliminary resonance of the site of origin responding to a confirmed match, the specific frequency of an ability that had found what it was built to find and was now simply waiting for the conditions to complete. He had found her. She was behind those doors and she had been alone for too long, and she was still herself despite all of it, still present and controlled and capable of asking hard questions through a sealed door at a stranger who claimed to know what she was. He thought she was extraordinary. He had 11 minutes tomorrow to begin proving it to her. He started planning. The direction was clear. He closed his eyes. In the morning, everything would begin. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to Anime Void for more amazing anime and manhwa recaps. What did you think about this video? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear your opinions. The 12 minutes became the structure of his days. Everything else in the palace, the work, the corridors, the weight of the hierarchy pressing down from every direction, organized itself around that window. Not consciously. Not in the way of someone who had decided to make something the center of their life and arranged everything else accordingly. More like the way water finds the lowest point in a landscape without being directed to it, naturally, inevitably, because that is simply where the ground leads. He was in the Eastern Service corridor every day. His rotation had not changed since the 8th day and he had no indication it was going to change. He moved through his assigned work with the same steady pace he always used, and when the guard rotation reached the window between departing pair and arriving pair he moved into the secondary corridor and stood in front of the sealed doors and they talked. 12 minutes. The first few days after the initial conversation were careful. That was the honest word for them. Careful in the way of two people who have said something significant to each other and are now in the process of determining whether what was said was real or whether it was the kind of thing that sounds real in a particular moment and reveals itself as something smaller when the moment has passed. Vane did not give him easy conversations. He had not expected her to. Someone who had spent years alone with her own thoughts behind a sealed door was not going to open a 12-minute window every day and fill it with the kind of surface exchange that people use when they are not sure yet how honest to be. She did not have the patience for that, and she had spent too long with real thoughts to want to replace them with performed ones. She asked him questions that had edges to them. Questions that were testing something. She asked them in a controlled voice that he was learning was not coldness but precision, the specific quality of someone who had learned to be very careful about what they put into words because words were the only thing she had and she was not going to waste them. She asked him on the second day how he knew his ability was telling him the truth about her. He said he did not know with certainty in the way that certainty required external verification. He said what he knew was that the ability had never shown him information that turned out to be wrong, that it did not appear to have a mechanism for producing false data because it was reading rather than interpreting, and that the specific classification it had generated for her was not something he could have produced through imagination because it was a category that had not existed in his understanding before the system created it to describe her. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said that was a careful answer. He said he tried to be careful with things that mattered. She did not respond to that immediately. He heard her moving on the other side of the door, a small sound of repositioning, and he understood from the quality of it that she was sitting close to the door. Close enough that the sound traveled through the ceiling array without too much compression. She asked him on the third day what his world was like. He told her. Not the version that made it sound better than it was. The actual version. A world with its own hierarchy, its own ranking system, its own way of deciding who mattered and who did not based on numbers that claimed to measure something essential and mostly just measured the thing the system had been designed to measure. He told her he had not been at the top of that hierarchy. He told her he had been at the bottom of it, publicly and officially and with the specific thoroughness of a world that had processed his case and reached its conclusion and moved on. She asked him if that had broken him. He said no. She asked him why not. He thought about it honestly before he answered. He said he thought the reason was that he had never fully believed the hierarchy's assessment of him, not because he had some extraordinary self-regard that made him immune to what the world said, but because the evidence the hierarchy was using to reach its conclusion was incomplete. The system he carried told him things about himself that the ranking numbers did not capture. And when you have access to information the assessment missed, the assessment's conclusion stops being the final word. She was quiet for a longer time after that. Then she said she understood that. The quality of her voice when she said it was different from the careful precision of the testing questions. It was something more direct. The sound of recognition. He said he thought she might. On the fourth day she told him something about herself without being asked. She said the ceiling array had been in place for 4 years. She said she had been told when it was established that it was for her protection, that the world outside was not ready for what she was, that the containment was temporary while a solution was developed. She said she had believed that for approximately the first 6 months. After 6 months she had stopped believing the temporary part. After a year she had stopped believing the protection part. After 2 years she had understood that the array was not about her well-being at all. It was about making the problem she represented invisible until someone could decide what to do with it. She said this without bitterness. That was the thing that struck him. The flatness of it, the absence of the anger that would have been completely reasonable to feel. Not because she had made peace with it. He did not think she had made peace with it. But because she had spent enough time alone with the reality of it that the acute edge of it had worn down into something that simply was, the way long-term pressure becomes indistinguishable from the baseline. He said that was a long time to be told you were a problem. She said she had decided some time ago that the problem was not hers. He said he agreed with that. She asked him what he meant. He said the problem was the world's. The world had built classification systems that worked until they encountered something they had not anticipated, and then instead of updating the system they tried to contain the thing that did not fit. That was not her failing. That was the system's limitation being made into her burden. The silence that followed lasted almost 2 full minutes of the 12 they had. When she spoke again her voice was still controlled, but there was something in it that had not been there before, a quality he did not have an exact word for. The quality of someone hearing something they had thought in private for a long time said out loud by another person for the first time. She said no one had ever said that to her before. He said he found that difficult to believe, but he understood why it had happened. She asked what he meant by that. He said the people around her had an investment in the narrative that she was the problem. Her father had made a decision based on that narrative, and reversing the narrative meant confronting the decision. The staff who maintained the array and the guard rotation were operating within instructions that assumed the narrative was correct. No one in her orbit had any incentive to offer her a different frame, because offering her a different frame would require them to think differently about everything that had been done in the name of the original one. She said that was a precise way of putting it. He said he had been thinking about it since the second day. On the fifth day she asked him about the ability he claimed could unlock what she was. He explained it carefully. He told her it was not something he directed at people without their awareness and consent. He told her it was a function that required active choice on his part, and that he had not used it on her, not even passively, beyond the initial reading that the site of origin had performed when he was standing at the junction 11 days ago. He told her the reading and the unlocking were different functions. Reading was what showed him what someone was. Unlocking was what allowed what they were to fully manifest. He could do one without doing the other. She asked him what unlocking her would mean in practical terms, that he said he did not know completely, because the bridge class designation was new, because the system had created that category specifically for her and had no prior cases to reference. What he knew was that the suppression array was holding something down that wanted to be expressed, and that the holding down was what was making the area around her wing different from the rest of the palace, that shimmer he had noticed from the junction on the first night. He said he believed, based on what the system had shown him, that unlocking it would not destroy anything. It would complete something. She was quiet. Then she asked him, very precisely, if it would hurt. He said he did not know. He said he would not tell her it would not hurt if he did not know that for certain. He said the other times he had used the ability the people described a feeling of something large moving through them, something that had been compressed for a long time suddenly having room. Whether that was painful or something else was not something he could tell her in advance. She said she appreciated that he had not just said no. He said she deserved accurate information more than she deserved comfortable information. The 12 minutes ended. He went back to his work. The days built on each other the way days do when something is developing that neither person is rushing. He learned her. Not in a complete way, not in the way you learn someone through years of ordinary proximity, but in the specific concentrated way of 12 minutes of honest conversation happening every day with no performance required from either side because the circumstances had stripped performance out of the equation. She was behind a sealed door. He was a negligible rank servant who had nothing to project and no audience to project it for. The 12 minutes were just the two of them and what they actually were. She was precise. She was sharp in the way of someone who had spent years with nothing but their own mind for company and had used that time to think carefully about things most people never sat still long enough to examine. She had opinions that were specific and supported, and she did not offer them tentatively. She stated them and then listened to what he said in response with genuine attention, the attention of someone who was interested in whether her positions held up rather than in defending them. She had humor. It was dry and it appeared unexpectedly, and the first time it appeared he almost missed it because it was so understated. He had been telling her about Petra, the human servant who knew the palace schedule better than the demon staff, and he had described Petra's particular way of moving through the kitchen sections with the authority of someone who had outlasted 3 different head cooks and had no intention of outlasting fewer. Vane said, in exactly the tone she used for everything else, that sounded like the only sensible way to operate in a large institution. He had paused, because the observation was both completely accurate and quietly funny, and then he had laughed, a short genuine sound, and from the other side of the door there had been a sound that took him a moment to identify because he had not heard it before from her. She had laughed too. It was small. It was brief. She recovered it quickly in the way of someone who had not laughed in long enough that the sound surprised her as much as it surprised him. But it was real and it had happened, and after that something in the 12 minutes was slightly different. Not warmer exactly. More inhabited. Like a room that has been empty for a long time and then someone lights something in it and the space becomes a different kind of space. On the 9th day after their first conversation, she asked him why he had come to the secondary corridor that first time. He told her the truth. He said the system had been orienting toward her since the first night. He said he had spent 11 days learning the palace and the rotation schedule and the guard window before he moved toward those doors, because moving before he understood the ground would have been reckless, and reckless was something he tried not to be with things that mattered. He said when he had heard her voice and the system had completed its display of her information, he had understood that this was what he had been pointed toward from the moment he arrived in the demon world. She asked him if he believed in that kind of direction. The idea that a system could point someone toward a specific destination. He said he had learned to trust it because it had been right consistently enough that ignoring it would have been a decision against evidence. She said that was a practical way to approach something that sounded like it could easily become mystical. He said he preferred practical. She said she had noticed. On the 11th day she told him about the last time someone from outside the wing had spoken to her as a person rather than as an obligation. She said it had been her father. Before the array. In the period when the thing she was had become undeniable, but before he had decided what to do about it. He had come to her rooms in the section of the palace she had lived in before the ceiling, and he had sat across from her and looked at her for a long time without speaking. She had been 16. She had understood something was happening, but she had not understood yet the shape of what it was going to be. He had told her she was extraordinary. He had said it the way people say true things that they are trying to use as a foundation for something that is going to be hard to say next. She had felt the shape of the conversation before he got to the next part. She had understood that the extraordinary was being used to justify something. He had told her the world was not ready. She had asked him when it would be. He had not answered that. 3 days later the ceiling array was in place and she was in the wing and the door was closed and the shimmer was around the frame, and she did not see him again except at the very long distances that the architecture of the palace sometimes allowed, glimpses in corridors she was not supposed to be in, observed without being observed in return. She said she did not tell him this because she wanted him to feel sorry for her. He felt something else, something that was closer to a specific kind of respect for the fact that she was still who she was after 4 years of that the isolation had not made her smaller or more afraid or less herself. She said she had decided early that becoming smaller was not an option because there was no version of smaller that would have satisfied the people who had put her there. If smaller was not going to fix anything, then there was no reason to do it. He said that was exactly the right conclusion. She said she was glad someone thought so. He said he did not think so. He knew so. The 12 minutes ended. He walked back to the main corridor and resumed his work and thought about a 16-year-old girl being told she was extraordinary in the same breath as being told the world was not ready for her and the door closing 3 days later. He thought about 4 years of maintaining yourself through the specific discipline of someone who has decided that what the world has done to them is not going to define what they do with themselves. He thought she was the most remarkable person he had encountered in either world. On the 14th day of their conversations he arrived at the secondary corridor and something was different. He knew it before he reached the doors. The site of origin registered it as a change in the information field around the wing, a shift in the quality of what the system was reading. Not wrong. Not alarming. Different. Like a pressure that had been constant for so long it had become the baseline had changed by a small but measurable degree. He stood in front of the doors and said her name quietly. She responded immediately. She had been close to the door already. He asked her if she was all right. She said she did not know what the word all right covered. He asked her what had happened. She said the maintenance team had come to service the ceiling array that morning. They came every month on a schedule. She knew the schedule better than they did. What she did not know was that they were going to bring a modification to the array configuration this time rather than just the standard maintenance. They had added something. She could feel it as a new layer on top of the existing working, a tightening, a compression that had not been there before. She said whatever she was, the thing the array was holding down, it had been pushing against the edges of the containment more noticeably in recent months. She said she had not told anyone this because telling anyone would have produced exactly the response it had apparently produced anyway, a tightening of the array, or reinforcement of the suppression. She said it was harder to breathe in the wing today than it had been yesterday. Not literally. He understood she did not mean the physical air. She meant the specific sensation of something in you that is pressing against its own containment with increasing force and finding the containment has just gotten stronger. He stood in front of the sealed doors and listened to this and felt something move through him that was not quite anger and not quite urgency but contained elements of both. Precise and clear and pointing in one direction. He asked her to listen to him carefully. She said she was listening. He said the modification to the array was a response to something the maintenance team had detected. Increasing pressure from inside. Meaning the ability that the array was suppressing was growing despite the suppression, pushing harder than it had been, making the containment show strain. He said that was not a crisis. That was information. That was the system she actually was asserting itself against something that was trying to hold it down, which was exactly what it should be doing. She was quiet. He said the tightening was going to keep happening. Every time the pressure increased they would tighten the array. And every time they tightened the array the pressure would increase in response because you cannot suppress something of that magnitude indefinitely. He said the question was not whether the array would eventually fail to hold. It was whether when that happened she would be prepared for it or whether it would happen to her rather than with her. She asked what the difference looked like. He said the difference was the contract. The silence was complete. He said he was not pushing her. He said she knew he was not pushing her because she had had 14 days of 12-minute conversations with him and she knew the difference between someone stating a fact and someone applying pressure. He was stating a fact. The array was going to reach a point where the reinforcement could not keep pace with what it was trying to contain. When that happened, if the ability that had been suppressed for 4 years released all at once with no structure and no guidance and no bond that gave it somewhere to go, the results would be unpredictable in ways that the demon noble houses would use as justification for everything they wanted to do. He said if she was contracted when it happened, the release would have a channel. It would have direction. It would be hers rather than something that happened to her. She said nothing for a long time. Long enough that he checked the time remaining in the rotation window. Then she said she needed him to answer a question honestly. He said yes. She said the contract required something from her that was not just ability related. She said she understood the classification requirements because she was not naive and she had access to information through the wing's limited connectivity and she had read everything she could find about the contract system that came with the kind of ability his was. She said she was not afraid of that requirement in the way of someone who had been damaged by experience, she was asking because she needed to understand what it meant in the context of what he was proposing. He said he understood what she was asking. He said the contract was not a transaction. It was not an exchange where she gave something and received a boost in return and those were the only terms. The contract was a bond. What it meant in practical terms was that they were linked in a way that was real and ongoing, not a one-time event. He said he was not going to make promises about what that grew into because they had known each other for 14 days of 12 minutes each and honesty required acknowledging that. But he could tell her what it was not. It was not him taking something from her. It was not a power arrangement dressed in different language. The bond moved in both directions. She said she knew that theoretically. He said he knew she knew it theoretically. He was telling her he meant it in the way that was not theoretical. Another silence. She asked him what happened after. If the array shattered and her ability released and the palace responded the way he had described the noble houses responding in one of their earlier conversations. She asked what his answer was to that. He said his answer was that he stayed. She said that was simple. He said it was the only answer that mattered, so there was no point making it complicated. The guard rotation was approaching. He had less than 2 minutes. He said they did not have to decide today. He said the rotation window was about to close and he was not going to use the last 90 seconds to pressure her into something. He said he would be here tomorrow and the day after and for as long as the assignment held, and she could take whatever time she needed. She said wait. He stopped. She said she had spent 4 years waiting for conditions that never arrived. She said she had waited for the world to be ready and the world had used that time to tighten the array. She said she was done making decisions based on what the world was prepared to accept. She said yes. The word came through the sealed door and the sealing array and the compressed sound between them, and it was the clearest thing he had heard since arriving in the demon world. He said her name. She said she was here. He said the process was going to require him to be on her side of the door. A pause. Then she said she understood that. She asked him how. He said not through the door. He said there was a maintenance access point built into the sealing array, required by the working zone design because any active array needed a point of entry for the people maintaining it. It would be in the frame of the door, most likely on the right side where the primary rune sequence began. It would not be visible to casual inspection, but the site of origin would find it. He heard her moving on the other side. Then she said she could see something in the frame. A seam. Different from the surrounding stone. He said yes. He said on her side it would respond to her touch because the array was keyed to the inhabitants of the wing. The access point would recognize her. The guard rotation was at the junction now. He could hear the footsteps. He said he had to go. He said tomorrow he would come to the access point and explain exactly how it worked from his side and they would prepare properly before anything happened. He said he was not going to rush this. She said she understood. He said she had made the right decision. She said she was beginning to think so. He turned and walked back to the junction at the same pace he always used and turned into the main corridor, and the incoming guard pair passed him without interest, a negligible rank servant in the Eastern Service corridor doing assigned work, not worth a second look. He kept moving. Inside his chest the system had shifted again. The preliminary resonance that had been building since the first conversation had changed quality. It was not the same passive orientation that a confirmed match produced while waiting for conditions to align. It was something further along in the process. Something that recognized that the conditions had shifted and the waiting was almost done. Tomorrow he would come to the access point with a plan. The day after that, or the day after that, or whenever she was ready, the sealed doors would open. And what had been locked behind them for 4 years would finally have room to be what it was. He did her the courtesy of not thinking about what came after that tonight. Tonight was for the fact that she had said yes. That a person who had been given every reason to stop trusting had looked at 14 days of 12 minutes and decided that was enough to stand on. He thought she was right. He thought that was more than enough. He walked back through the Eastern Service corridor and through the main palace corridors to the lower servant quarters and through the door of his small room and sat on the edge of the bed in the same way he had sat on it on the first night, and the difference between that first night and tonight was the difference between arriving somewhere and knowing why you were there. He knew why he was there now. He was there for her. And tomorrow everything would begin to move toward the moment when what had been held down for 4 years would finally break through what was holding it, and the two worlds that had spent all this time deciding what to do with a being they could not categorize were going to discover that the being had decided for herself. He turned off the light. In the sealed wing on the other side of the palace, in the silence that had been her only company for 4 years, Vane sat close to the door that would open soon and felt, for the first time in longer than she wanted to count, something that was not patience or endurance or the disciplined maintenance of herself against the pressure of everything around her. She felt like something was about to begin. She was right. Want to see what happens next? Subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss the next part.